Cautiously, you step into the chamber. The dying light of day filters in through windows, revealing, gathered around a table, a huddled mass of humanoids. Together as one, their heads lift, eyes flickering in the lamplight. One of them, probably the leader, speaks through a mouthful of crumbling food. "Is it time for D&D Club?" I'm Ethan Schoonover, also known as Mr. E, and this is going to be a video about running a role-playing game club at a school. I work at a Seattle-based girls' middle school, grades 6th, 7th, and 8th, so that's roughly ages 11, 12, 13, 14. I have, for the past about 2 years, run a D&D after-school program on Fridays, and that started off with 6 girls. It's now over 20 girls. I've also run a D&D elective class during the day for credit, an elective class based around D&D. I have run a 5-day intensive D&D summer camp. So I have a lot of thoughts about how to run a role-playing game club at a school, at least at my school. And I'd like to talk a little bit about it and just give you some ideas about what has worked for me, share some of my own experiences, and hopefully there's going to be enough commonality in that you will be able to take away some of that information and build on that to run a successful club at your own schools, or in your own libraries, or in your own community centers. So I'd like to break this out into 5 sections. The first section will be talking about pitching the idea of a role-playing game club. How do you get it off the ground? Then we'll talk a little bit about selecting the system and why it is, for example, I selected D&D. Then we'll talk a little bit about the first session and how important the first session can be for a new group of players, particularly students. That will lead into a discussion about running the adventure on an ongoing basis and managing the club. And then what happens when you grow bigger? How do you address the changes that are going to occur between running, say, a group for, a half dozen students to several dozen students? So with that, we're going to jump in now to pitching the club. So let's do this anecdotally. When I started the D&D club at the school that I work at, it was based around a couple of, there was a little bit of impetus for this from a student who was really keen to play D&D with me. And they had pestered me for quite a while in a good way to do this. I had mentioned I was interested in doing it, and they were like, well, when is that starting? Wasn't it starting? I didn't really have a slot available to me, and suddenly, one day, out of the blue, the person who coordinates after-school programs came to me and said, hey, we have a sudden opening on Friday nights. Would you want to run some sort of a class on Friday nights? They had no idea I was interested in doing a D&D class, but I'd run some programming classes, so I was a resource for them. That's number one tip right there, is be an after-school resource for people. Doesn't matter what you're doing, just get in there and start doing stuff. That opens up other possibilities and other opportunities. Now, so they came to me and they said Friday nights, and Friday nights are a terrible night to run any sort of a club at a school because people are tired. Students are tired. They've been learning all week. They just want to go home, or if they're there, they're just not they're not able to focus as well as when it's, a morning or lunchtime activity, let alone, any other day of the week. So when I was offered the Friday night club, my response was a resounding yes. I was absolutely no problem. I was going to tackle this. It was a good decision. There are certainly challenges to running a Friday night club. I'm still doing it. This year I renewed again for Friday nights for the D&D club. Happy to do it then. And there's advantages and disadvantages. I know folks, for instance, that will run clubs at lunchtime in schools, D&D clubs or role-playing game clubs. And that has some advantages. Maybe the kids are a little bit, they're not as tapped out as they would be at the end of the day. The disadvantage for me of running during the day would be that your time slot is just a lot shorter, a lot tighter. And I would rather take 2 hours on a Friday night when I know that I have some challenges with keeping the kids focused, but I feel like the game does a pretty good job at that on its own, and I'd rather have a larger block of time. So, pick your time carefully. Then let's talk about how you position it and how you position the whole idea of a role-playing games club. It's really fascinating to me that there are some games and play activities that are socially acceptable in schools. So, for example, sports, right? Sports are games. very physical games, and they are socially acceptable. Chess club, totally acceptable, socially acceptable. Then you have things like role-playing game clubs, and that's maybe not, people are just not as familiar with it. And so for me, like when I suggested running D&D as an after-school program, there was a little bit of pushback, and some of the pushback was things like, say, isn't that devil worship game? And of course I responded with just a little bit of devil worship in there. No, of course I dismissed that and I put their mind at ease. But you're going to get that, especially depending on where you live in the world or in the United States. Regionally, this can vary significantly, but you may get some people who are concerned about that, and you need to have some talking points ready to address it. You also want to really be talking about the benefits, and so first of all, I pitched it as there are social emotional benefits and there are academic benefits. And the social emotional benefits are, obviously we're developing interpersonal skills. This is face-to-face time. This is an opportunity for girls to come, and I say girls, they're students. I work at a girls' school, so often I'll use that instead of the word student. But you have a chance for them to come together at a table and to work together. So social emotional growth, interpersonal skills development, those are great. Obviously, there are some academic things that you can build in. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of reading and opportunity for creative problem solving. There's an opportunity for art and research. So I even throw in some lightweight math occasionally. You can study the probability of dice, all sorts of stuff. You don't want to oversell it, obviously, but I wouldn't shy away from saying that there are real benefits to sitting down at a table and playing role-playing games together. There's also some great research around this. That's somewhat of I think a subject for a separate video. But focus on those key points, those key benefits. Have a one sheet that you put together which includes all this information that you can present to people. And you can say, look, this is what we're proposing. These are the benefits. These are the outcomes that we're focused on. And I found that to be a good way to launch it successfully. Now, there's one key phrase that I think you should consider using. And that's a phrase that I actually picked up on when I was pitching the idea of the D&D summer camp. And when I would talk to parents, I would use this phrase, and it was almost all I needed to say. And that phrase is no screen time. So you just say no screen time, and parents' eyes light up. The whole concept of running any sort of an activity where kids are not on their phones, I think, is really powerful. It is something that you need to think about doing. If you do have a school environment that allows phones, then consider mandating that this is a no phone activity. I think it's really important for people to come together and be very present and respectful of each other. And one of the ways that they can do that when doing role-playing games is turn those phones off, put them away. Personally, I think it's a little crazy to have phones in a classroom. I get that there are some reasons for this sometimes, but I'd rather just see the role-playing game club not have phones at all, no screens. So that was how I pitched it. Had bullet points, talked to the parents. Oh, one thing I did also is I didn't call it D&D club initially, and you may not be running D&D, you may be running some other role-playing game system, but in our case, because there was a little bit of concern that it would be seen as just a game, I originally called it Swords, Stories, and Statistics. Because, man, what parent does not love the idea of sending their kids to a statistics club? And that worked out really well. People, they no problems with it. However, a week in, everybody was calling it D&D Club because the students called it D&D Club because that's how they explained it to their friends. Hey, oh yeah, I'm in D&D Club. So we just now pretty much call it D&D Club, D&D class, D&D summer camp, and it's fine. Now that, again, using the term D&D here, I am running D&D with the kids. But I did not intend originally, I did not plan on using Dungeons & Dragons. So that leads us into the next section, which is selecting the system. So when I selected the system that I wanted to play with, in the role-playing game club. Originally, I thought, well, D&D there's a lot of rules in D&D. There's a lot of books. Maybe it's too much to start off with new players, and maybe I should run something a little bit simpler or lighter weight, or that just runs a little bit faster and looser. And ultimately, I decided no, D&D is that was the right system for us, and I'd like to lay out the reasons why. I think that these are all valid considerations, and they're things that you should factor in when you're selecting a system to run. There is a ton of role-playing game systems out there. Now, first of all, if you're running for younger players, you make your own choice there. So I'm talking about middle schoolers. There's some great systems, especially for younger kids, like No Thank You Evil, where you can run very successful role-playing games that are on a very introductory level and see great success from that. I went with D&D for a couple of reasons. One, I work at a girls' school. Role-playing games, I am well aware, have traditionally been marketed at people that look like me. They have traditionally been marketed at boys. And I wanted to make sure that there was zero gatekeeping involved in this, that I not only gave the girls at my school a role-playing game club, but that I gave them ownership of the whole idea of role-playing games. And honestly, when we're talking about role-playing games, the lingua franca of role-playing games is D&D. So I wanted them to be able to walk into any game store or retail bookstore and to see Dungeons and Dragons on the shelf and say, hey, that's my game. I own that game. Like I play that game. I know how to play it. That's my jam. So that was really important to me. I want them to have a sense of ownership of this and to have access to that larger community for whom D&D is, again, it's sort of the baseline role-playing game. Now, you can go with something else, but I think it's important to understand, it's a really important consideration that when their cousin comes to visit, they could play D&D together. Or when it's summer break, they can go and find a D&D club, and they don't have to feel like an outsider again because they don't know the rules, or it's not the game that they've been playing. So that's reason one. D&D is also very robust. So the way that we play D&D, I mean, listen, the way that everybody plays D&D is a little bit different. And the way that we play D&D in our after-school program varies even right now from like group to group, depending on who's running the game. It is malleable. It is robust. You can excise large swaths of the rule set, and it is still recognizably D&D. So because of that flexibility, because it's the lingua franca, and because I wanted them to have a sense of ownership of role-playing games, that's why I chose D&D. I considered DCC for a while, and I actually stole some things from DCC. DCC is Dungeon Crawl Classics, by the way, by Goodman Games. And it's a game that I play a lot. I really enjoy it. It is got a very old school kind of D&D feel to it. And there's some cool ideas that I really wanted to make use of. Turns out you can make use of those ideas in D&D, and that leads us into sort of the next section of this talk, which is really about running that first session, what's important, and the changes and decisions that I made to really make it work for my students. For the first session, I had one overriding concern. I wanted it to be super fun. I wanted the students in my D&D club to report back on Monday and say, when their friends asked them, how was that weird club that you joined on Friday that Mr. E is running? I wanted the response to be, it was super fun, it was awesome, you should totally play D&D with us. I didn't want it to be, oh, that was a little slow, or we had a lot of, it was like doing homework, but it's supposed to be more fun next time. D&D can be like that sometimes, right? There's a lot of bookkeeping and paperwork and calculating and doing there's a lot of upfront stuff. And I didn't want that. So I knew that I wanted to have what Mike Shea, aka Sly Flourish, calls a strong start, which is meaning just jump right into the action as fast as possible. But I also wanted to give the girls some autonomy and control and have them build a character. I think building a character, and what that means we can discuss in a moment, but building a character is a key part of role-playing games and D&D. So that was a little bit of a quandary. So what I did is I mentioned, again, I've selected D&D, but I liked some things from DCC. One of the things I liked from Dungeon Crawl Classics is the concept of zero level. This is actually not originally from DCC. This goes back as far as 2nd edition AD&D. And the idea is that you're not, very simply, you're not yet first level. In DCC in particular, as a zero level character, you're just a villager, you're a commoner. You are not a heroic, noble figure, you're just somebody. and circumstances have just created such a situation that you've been thrust into some sort of an adventure. And that was what I wanted to recreate. So what I did with the students is I sat them all down. And let me just be clear. The initial group that I was working with was 6 girls, 6 students. So I sat them all down and I said, you're going to take 3d6. You're going to roll 3d6 in order, and those are going to be your stats. Very old school. Now, I don't recommend that. Go ahead and use 4d6 or use the standard matrix of numbers. I've done both since then. I was running it pretty pretty old school. And once we had those stats, so you generate your stats however you want. Then we picked a race, and then we named our character, and I gave them a list of names, and I think this is very important. You want to give them a list of names to work from. It doesn't, don't mandate that they have to pick those names, but give them something to work from, because everything's new, right? They're learning, the whole idea of sitting down at a table and playing this story-based cooperative role-playing game that's a little unnerving right there. And then to be on the spot and have to think up an awesome name for your character. Some students do it just fine in my experience. Some students need a little bit of help, or they need some ideas. And some students just want to look at a list and say, hey, that's my name. So I have a one sheet list of names, which I'm happy to link to in the show notes below. And it's a great sort of starting place for students to come up with a good name for their character. So that once we had the stats, we had race, we had a name, then here's the real key. I had them roll for a background. And this could be, I used a D30, you could use a D100, depends on how long your list is. But I had a list of backgrounds that I had created in a spreadsheet. And then next to each background was a list of starting equipment. Now the backgrounds were not like the backgrounds that you see normally in the player's handbook in D&D. So there was no sort of noble, you're a folk hero background. These backgrounds are things like you're a pig farmer, you are a stable hand, you are a glass blower, you are a librarian's assistant, you are an apprentice hunter. Anything, these are just sort of generic fantasy trope medieval setting jobs that you might have. And often very grim. Not necessarily fun or exciting, but boy, the students love them. They create these elaborate backstories. I had one student who recently, she got the background of librarian's assistant, and she picked Dragonborn as her race because there was this, such a fun idea for her of wandering around the library as a Dragonborn breathing fire and not being able to do that among the stacks of books. So she's, her whole thing is she couldn't sneeze, she couldn't cough. She always had to be very careful. And because of that, she's very shy. She's very reserved. So, it seems like a simple thing, but you can still create a ton of fun backstory and character development around these backgrounds. So we've got stats, race, name, background. That was it. And it didn't take long, probably took as long as it took me to just describe it. Once they've had all that written down on a sheet of paper, or you can use a character sheet. I use these character sheets from Luke Howard, and I'll link to those as well below. They're super fun, they're super cute, and you don't have to fill them all in. Don't fill in the whole sheet. We did not fill in things like alignment or anything like that. I didn't spend any time explaining any of this. We didn't do proficiencies, we didn't do skills, we just did stats, and that was it. And then we start off and we're playing in a village. And you're in this village, and life's happening, right? You're going about your daily business, and then trouble comes to town. And that's different depending on, whatever story or adventure I'm running. But basically, I create some sort of very compelling trouble or danger or situation such that the players have to leave the environment that they're in, usually with nothing other than what's in their hands and pockets, and they have to take off and flee the village or flee the current situation. And this creates this sense of anxiety and so a little bit of terror and, wow, what's going on? What's happening? And that's what you want. You want them to feel at first, a little bit out of control, and boy, we have to figure out what's going on. And they have to also figure out how to overcome the obstacles that they're going to face with very limited resources, right? So they don't have that sword +5. They don't have magic spells. They have nothing. But their brains and maybe some rope and a piece of chalk. That was a great example, actually, from one of my students. Her starting equipment included a piece of chalk, and I shaped the adventure at one point such that they were in this like very labyrinthine dungeon, and they had to use the chalk to make marks on the wall so that they didn't get lost. So, there's always opportunity for them to use this simple stuff in fun ways. So that was how I started off with the first session, and that was a little bit of, people use the term session 0 to describe that initial session that you run. Our session 0 content, again, was largely things like building the character, very basic background stuff, and then jumping into effectively session 1, which is that first big jump into the adventure. And we also covered the table rules. And the table rules I try to keep pretty simple, but they're important. And the first table rule I have is no evil, everyone works together. Actually, that's the first 2 rules. So you can't have an evil character, and everybody has to work together. For whatever reason, it's up to them to come up with the reasoning, but no sticks in the mud. You can't be sitting there saying, I'm not going to go. You have to go. You have to go on the adventure, and you come up with the reason why your character is going to do that. Then, again, so this is all happening. I explained to the girls, actually my first group, I told them, you're negative 50 experience points right now. You're level 0. You have to work your way up to level 1. Later on, now I only do, I don't even do experience points. I just do milestone advancement. So I just say, you're level 0. You will work your way up to level 1. And after the girls, by the way, they did that for 6 weeks. They were level 0, and they worked through just all sorts of very basic adventuring, like through woodland and through, crossing a river and encountering strange beasts and finding their first dungeon, which was very exciting. And after that, they graduate, and there's this little ceremony that we did, and I actually presented them with these little fantasy-themed necklaces, and they became level 1 characters. And I asked them, I said, how did you feel? Like, let me tell you one thing. By the way, normally when you play D&D, you start off at level 1, because I didn't want them to crack open the player's handbook in the future and be like, Mr. E lied to us. There's no level 0. But I explained to them, I said, this is why I did it. And how did you feel about it? I had to gauge whether or not I would do it again. And universally, almost every girl said the same thing. They all loved it, first of all, but they all said, I feel like I earned level 1, and I feel like I'm really invested in my character. Like, they really valued that whole experience of kind of coming from nothing and becoming somebody and in the story. So I loved it. Just to summarize again, starting off as level 0, you ramp into the rules. Build a minimal character, spend as little time as possible doing it, but still create a character. Give them that background, just do it off a table, have them roll for it. Anytime you can introduce some very basic rolling and get the idea of rolling dice is great. And then you give them that introductory adventure where you're training them, you're giving them a very gentle and gradual introduction to the different tropes of Dungeons and Dragons or whatever role-playing game system you're playing. And as the opportunities present themselves, you can introduce new rules. And the canonical example of that for me is the idea of alignment. So I did say no evil characters. We didn't really set alignment right away, so that didn't matter too much. They just said the general idea of, we're not bad guys, we're the good guys. Or at least not the bad guys, right? And we had an early battle. And the early battle involved humanoids. In fact, it was kobolds. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next section of Running the Adventure. But the kobold battle, I thought, here, let's just get some generic, D&D monsters. And again, I'm coming from, D&D in the 80s is always sort of in the background of my mind. And so for me, monsters are, you're going to have kobolds in there, right? And I have had a change of heart about this since then, but I presented these kobolds as kidnappers. They'd kidnapped this little girl, and boy, they were incensed. They were upset about this. They were going to get those kobolds. And I thought, well, maybe they can go in and drive them off or something. But no. They went in. They were attacking the kobolds, and I realized that this was going to get pretty bloody. And I didn't want the students to go home and say to their parents, man, we had a great D&D session today. We slaughtered those kobolds. I wanted them to go home and talk about having a great D&D session, but without the murder. So I said to them, let's do this. This time round, you can fight to subdue them. And so they did, and then they tied up the kobolds, and then one of the students in my group who really likes to finish things. She likes to tie things off with a little bow and just, that's it. It's done. It's complete. No loose ends. And so she looked at me after they had tied up the kobolds and she said, Mr. E, now we're going to kill them. And I knew like that's what we call the teachable moment. And I said, all right, let's talk about alignment. We're going to pick alignments right now, and then we're going to decide what your characters will do. And so she ended up actually picking a lawful good character or a lawful neutral character. And based on her choice, we then talked about what her character would do. So look for those opportunities, introduce new rules as you can, introduce the idea of skill checks and ability checks, and introduce the idea of proficiency later on when it feels right, when it feels natural. So let's talk a little bit about running the adventure and what it means some guidelines for running the adventure long term, how to approach it, how to prepare for it, and make sure that things stay on track. So running the adventure from week to week for me has been a learning experience. At first, I mentioned that I have 6 students starting on that Friday, that initial Friday night club that I ran. And those 6 students, that was 2 more than I wanted, first of all. I was nervous because I didn't think I could handle 6 students. I was pretty sure I could handle 4, maybe 5 in a pinch. 6, no way I was going to die. And you always get anxious as a dungeon master before a session. But I wouldn't say nervous. I was a little concerned that I just wouldn't do a great job with that many students. I have since, by the way, run for groups of 12 or 14 or more students in a single session, a single party. And I don't recommend doing that all the time. It changes the game significantly, but I think it's totally achievable, totally doable, and manageable with some changes in the way that you approach things. So I'm not worried so much about that big group, but I was a little stressed out about it, and there are a couple approaches, a couple techniques and resources that I used that really helped me to not only manage the game on an ongoing basis, but feel much less stressed about it. So the first of those is this book right here. This is Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. Now, when I started, it was not yet Return. It was just Lazy Dungeon Master. And this is a book by Mike Shea, a.k.a. Sly Flourish. And Mike has written a bunch of great resource books for Dungeon Masters, for game mastering. Even if you're not playing Dungeons & Dragons, check this book out. It's just great sound advice for how to prepare and how not to over-prepare, and how to prepare the right stuff to play D&D or any other role-playing game. So a lot of the advice in Mike's book revolves around the idea of, again, not over-preparing, preparing in as little as possible, but preparing the right stuff, and creating outlines, creating frameworks of the right materials and NPCs. So that book really, I think it saved my life, because I was able to do my regular work and my regular job for 40 or 50 hours a week and still have enough capacity and time and brain power and attention to prepare an adventure. And one of Sly Flourish's recommendations, of course, is insights, I guess, is by the idea that by not over preparing, your game is going to feel more fresh and spontaneous as well. So it's not just an advantage on the back end of, I'm only going to spend 30 minutes preparing for this multi-hour adventure. That's great. But the adventure itself is going to be a richer and more rewarding experience for everybody at the table, because I didn't over-prepare. I didn't create kind of this calcified adventure. I created a living, breathing world. So check out that book. I also use this book, which is Hamlet's Hit Points. And this is by Robin D. Laws. This is a book that talks about Robin's concept of story beats or narrative beats. And there's a lot of great information in there. It changed the way that I run the game at the table, the pacing of it, the pacing specifically of the narrative components of what Robin D. Laws calls the up and down beats. So the idea of creating hope or joy and fear or anxiety, and just alternating between those two general types of beats, but he breaks it down into a system of other types of narrative story points. So take a look at those books. Those helped me a tremendous amount. Another thing that I did was I did not run with the player's handbook right away. So I actually have, let's see if I have a copy of it here. This is this is the basic rule PDF from Wizards of the Coast. Right here is a free resource that Wizards provides for us. Man, honestly, so great. They actually just revised this a little bit ago. I think this is the old 0.3 version, but they now have a 1.0 version of this, and it's even better because the new PDF, which is the free basic rules from Wizards, D&D basic rules, is a combination of the player's handbook, basic stuff from the monster manual, and basic stuff from the Dungeon Master's Guide, all rolled into one PDF that you can download for free and print for personal use. So that is what I provided my students. I printed out copies of that PDF and I gave it to my students in, nicely bound in a little folder here, and they love it. It's actually simpler than the player's handbook. There's not as much art. It's not as beautiful, but it doesn't have. It's missing some stuff. So it doesn't have things like tieflings or dragonborn, some of the quote unquote newer races as I think about them. But it actually, because it's missing some stuff, it made the choices easier for the students because there was less stuff to choose from. Still fun, still D&D, and it's free. So again, check that out. I'll put a link down below to those three resources: Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, Hamlet's Hit Points, and the D&D Basic Rules PDF. But those were great resources for me in terms of running the game on an ongoing basis. We talked a little bit about my table rules of no evil characters and the party works together. But I have one other secret rule that I don't tell the players about. And this secret rule is something they ask me about all the time. And the question that they ask is every couple of sessions, they will say, "Mr. E, are you going to kill our characters?" And of course, the proper response to that question is just to raise your eyebrow and look mysterious. But of course, I'm probably not going to kill our characters. My rule is essentially no death. No player character death. No player death either, but no player character death. And I don't feel like it adds a lot of value. My students become very invested in their characters, and I don't see that killing those characters off unnecessarily really adds anything to the game. Now, my friends Adam and Adam at Game to Grow they have a lot of thoughts about this as well, and I think they generally don't kill characters, but they have had situations where they have killed characters because, for instance, their player wanted to move on to a new character, and had felt like they had outgrown their current character, and they have some interesting choices that they've made about that, which I think are really cool. One of them is that they allow the player to basically go out with a bang and do something super heroic and dramatic, or to choose the way in which their character will die. So there are ways that you can have death, I think, that is character death. Again, player character death. There are ways that you can have player character death at the table, which can be healthy, fun, rewarding, not traumatic, not unnecessary. It really adds value. For the most part, and I'm actually not against using that in my own table. I haven't had an opportunity to because my players, for the most part, are just super invested in their own characters and they like to hold on to them. So no death, one of the rules that I have. Another rule that I have, which again is sort of a secret rule or just a Dungeon Master only rule, is that I try to avoid having the players in situations where they end up being murdery. I talked about the kobolds a moment ago. I mean, I grew up playing D&D in the 80s, and it was a pretty murdery game. You met somebody that was not one of the standard races, and then you decided that that's a monster, and you just killed them, which is terrible, right? But D&D is a game of combat, so you have to think about how you approach this. The way that I do it is I just have decided that our world is complicated. And not every humanoid race that you meet is, first of all, they're not homogeneous. You're going to meet good orcs and bad orcs, and you're going to meet good kobolds and mean kobolds and whatever, right? People are complicated. Humanoid creatures are complicated. So I just try to avoid situations where the players just leap to conclusions and go in and start murdering things. So, especially humanoid creatures. So most of the creatures that I have in my game are, if there's something where I want combat to occur, or I want to have an option for combat, then it's usually like insect creatures or obvious weird entities or what have you. Even then, there are plenty of times when the students will find ways to talk with the creatures or negotiate or come up with very creative solutions other than combat. Regardless, I just try to avoid being murdery. That's my general guideline there. And I also, here's another, I guess this isn't so much a rule as a set of guidelines. I optimize my D&D play with the students. I optimize for fun and creativity through constraint. And I do not optimize for rules lawyering. So I don't optimize for crunch. And yeah, I like the crunchy component of D&D. I enjoy that. I think that is, in fact, part of the constraint. I think you should know the rules, and I think it's great to continue to introduce the rules to the students. But I want them to have fun first and foremost, and I want them to understand that what we're doing is we're simulating this world and environment of constraints that they have to solve through combat or social interaction or creative problem solving of some other type, and to think about it in a creative way. So I optimize for that. I optimize for fun and creativity through constraint, not for crunchy rules. So that's how I run the adventure on an ongoing basis. Those are sort of the 3 or 4 rules that I have, or guidelines that I have for both the players and myself. And I think that we can talk a little bit now more about managing the club on an ongoing basis. Now, the biggest challenges I have managing the club are really the basics, like classroom management. So I have, Friday night, I have 4 students now pile into this big room in the school, and they're tired. Their forebrain is kind of shutting down a little bit, executive functioning, going offline, and they all sit down in a circle, and the first thing I do is feed them, make sure they have a snack. We actually do that twice. We call the second snack second breakfast. So I will hear cries of second breakfast in the halls about an hour into play. And we will break again. We'll have a second snack. So I think it's important, just this kind of like classroom and like just body management, right? Like you're managing like where students are, where they're sitting, that they are sitting at all, that they are fed and watered, and that they're able to self-manage all that stuff. That's a lot of the management that goes into running a successful club. So those general classroom and school management skills really come into play. Another thing that I do is this is a little bit of a difference between running the club and running the class that I've done. In my D&D class that happens during the day, it is a class, and you are sitting in your chair for the most part. We sometimes get up, and we sometimes will even act things out and do almost like LARPing, but that's like a conscious choice. And the D&D club's a little bit looser, right? The D&D club is happening after school. It's happening on a Friday night. And I'm kind of walking that line between that feeling you have when you're playing with your friends at home. My friend Sammy and I used to sit down and we'd be huddled up, next to like my wood stove at home, and we'd be playing D&D, and we'd be running around, or we'd be like, rolling on the floor laughing. That feeling, so I'm going for something between that and that kind of classroom experience, right? So I still have to manage the girls. I can't let it get totally crazy and out of control, but I want it a little bit of crazy, a little bit of chaos. I want it to be okay for the students to get up on their chairs and swing their imaginary sword at a foe, or raise it high and make some mighty declaration. I want that kind of stuff to happen. And so you have to know how to allow a little bit of free reign, but be able to pull it back in when necessary. And it's a fine line to walk, but if you can do it right, it's super fun and rewarding. So that's sort of the biggest challenge, is both just general classroom management and also allowing a little bit of that freedom and chaos and spontaneity to occur. Let's see. So feeding the troops I talked about. Oh, communication is another one. Communicating with parents and students. I almost over communicate, but just making sure that parents are aware of things like scheduling, talking to the students about scheduling, just over communicating like where they need to be and when they need to be, and what happens if a student doesn't come in. You probably have a lot of rules at your school about how to manage an after-school club, making sure that you stick to those rules, that you know them. For instance, like, do students have to sign in and out? Do parents have to sign out when they pick them up? It can get pretty loose, and you really have to be careful. Like, I have parents who will say, like, oh, well, I'm going to have so-and-so pick up 2 other students today, or my student will go home with somebody else, or my student will take the bus home. And just keeping track of all that can be super complicated. So a lot of that housekeeping stuff on the back end can be overwhelming unless you have some sort of system in place. And could be just a spreadsheet, doesn't matter. But you have to have something, and you have to make sure to cross your T's and dot your I's. So over communicate with parents and students, generally that's my strategy, but making sure everybody knows, like, if I'm going to be gone a day or something like that. And I should talk a little bit about the management of a bigger group. So let's talk a little bit about what happens when you grow bigger. Success, right? So your club is popular and more people want to join. What are you going to do? My personal experience, I started off with 6 girls, Friday nights. Then I had an additional class during the day of 8 students. And then that grew into this summer camp that I ran. And the summer camp was 18 students. And for that, I decided, okay, I'm going to bring in 2 other adults to run as Dungeon Masters. And we've had even more adults come in to do other activities with them. So when this year rolled around, I thought, okay, I've got this. I figured this out. I have a technique now. I'm going to open up the Friday night D&D club with no student limit. So as many students as want to join can. And I estimated we could easily double from 6 students to 12 students. Well, we did not just double, we quadrupled. So right now we're at 23 students. It's going to be even more in a couple of weeks. But, I thought, okay, it's not a problem. Not a problem. I'll get more Dungeon Masters, more grown-ups. And I'll clone myself, right? I'll find people who run D&D in a skilled and effective manner as a Dungeon Master, who have classroom management skills, who can come every Friday night from 3:30 to 5:30 for 2 hours, regularly, reliably, without missing a day. It turns out that's hard to do. It's hard enough to get people together as adults to play D&D. It's as challenging to get people to reliably come every Friday, regardless of their schedule and other obligations in life. It's just, and understandably hard. So I've actually thought since then about how I might restructure things so that I could have people come in as coaches for a short-term basis, or run shorter campaigns and not have this long-term obligation. That's a separate video. I will talk about that another time. But let me talk about how I solved this problem, and that is through turning my students into Dungeon Masters. Now, first thing, I picked girls that I had in class already in my D&D class or my D&D club. So they were experienced. And I picked a couple of them, and we talked it over, and we picked a third student that we thought might be interested. And we approached them, and we said, hey, would you be interested in doing D&D as a Dungeon Master this year? They were all super excited about it. And it has worked well, but I gave them some tools and resources. And number one rule or resource that I gave them, they all have a copy of this book. They all love it. Again, Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master by Mike Shea, a.k.a. Sly Flourish. And I will link to that in the show notes here. But they have a copy of that book, and I actually go through it with them. So I spent, the first couple of weeks, for several weeks, we would read, first chapter, second chapter of that book, and really understand what Mike Shea's system and technique was, so that we could apply it successfully, so that they could apply it successfully. And I focused on that book because I didn't want, it's a lot to put on a student's shoulders to say, like, okay, every Friday, you're basically going to be doing a bunch of homework to prepare for this thing. You are going to be effectively up on stage performing in front of your peers, and you're going to have some basic classroom management responsibilities to boot. So that's a lot. That's a big ask. Not every student is ready to take that on or has capacity in their life and mind to take that on at that moment. So you have to pick carefully. And you really have to support them. You have to make sure that they have not only tools like the Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, but they have your time and energy to acquaint them with that material, to make sure they understand the techniques, to make sure they are not spending tons of time preparing, and to make sure that they have things like pre-written adventures. So I actually used a couple other Sly Flourish books. I used the Fantastic Adventures book and Fantastic Locations, and I gave them the choice to take adventures out of these books and run them at their own tables, or to modify them, or to discard them and to create their own material. And in fact, I had different dungeon masters approached it different ways. I had one girl who did write her entire adventure from scratch. I had another who modified, and I had another one who ran basically straight from the book. So you want to be the one providing those resources and not just leaving it on their shoulders to figure out. You also want to be talking. So, I communicate with them. I have a regular Thursday meeting at lunchtime with the Dungeon Masters where we just sort of talk about like what went well, what didn't go well, what would they like to improve, what questions do they have. And, oftentimes it's rules questions like how do I run combat? It could be they might have questions about how to make it more fun or how to make it like one time one of the Dungeon Masters asked me how to make things move faster because they felt like they were, everybody just wants to shop. They just were stuck in town shopping. I'm like, well, sometimes that happens. But, being able to coach them and give them advice like that it's useful for them. It will provide insight for you in terms of like how the groups are being run. And you need to just carve out some time for that. So that's a thumbnail sketch of my advice for running with student DMs. Make sure to support them and check in on them as well. Over time it can become stressful, or maybe they suddenly have a lot going on in their lives, and you need to be able to say, like, have your finger on that pulse and know when it's time for them to shift over to somebody else running that game for them. I don't want my students to ever feel like they're stuck in that role or that they don't get to play. Even though it is a form of play to be a dungeon master, I want to create a situation where they can swap out and let somebody else run. That's been a lot of information, and I appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. I hope it was useful. Please reach out to me on Twitter. I'm at Ethan Schoonover. I'm always happy to talk about this stuff. I'd love to hear what suggestions out of this video worked for you, or what you've changed and how you've changed it. It's been very rewarding for me personally. I think you'll find it rewarding as well to run an RPG club at your school, and please let me know how things go. Again, I'm Ethan Schoonover. Thanks for watching.